We'll start right in. We always like to be prompt. Thanks everybody for being here. This will be on the record. What we'll do, I'll speak for 30 minutes or so and then turn it over to members. I am Blair Efron, Vice Chair at the Council, and we're delighted to have Meredith Whittaker, the President of Signal and its foundation. You've been pretty much at the forefront of conversations, technology related, whether it's the private sector, government, and academia. So we'll get into a lot. But let's start, if we could, Meredith, talking about Signal a bit in terms of, you started in 2018. You had this idea that you should do it as a nonprofit. You're up to 70 million users. What was the genesis of actually having Signal, and why nonprofit?
Yeah, well, first, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Stacy and Olivia. You made it really easy on my team. So there's a lot of ways to approach that question. I think, Signal came out of a aspirational open source project that has actually been around since, we can date it to kind of the mid-2000s, when we were beginning to see the growth of the commercial internet and the commercial internet as a driver of communications, whether it's Gmail sort of launching at the end of the 2007, maybe 2006, and a recognition among the technical community that these were not being built for privacy, and that these were not being built with the human right for privacy in mind by the companies that were positioned to offer these as consumer services. And there's a long history here around sort of how the business model of acquiring data to build models that help you classify different people who use your services and then sell access to those people to advertisers and others sort of developed out of the 90s. And I might sidebar for a second, if you don't mind, like a historical segue here, but I think it's important to recognize, there's some what I've called the kind of original sins of the growth of the commercial internet that I believe should be more widely understood when we try to diagnose what's going on and how do we solve this myriad of problems that seems pretty overwhelming and kind of related to tech, but hard to pin down as one thing or another. So you had in the 90s this imperative to commercialize networked computation. And so you roll into the 90s, you have stagflation, you have diminishing manufacturing, you have a bad economy, and a need, particularly from the Clinton campaign and then the Clinton administration, to find something that would heal this ill, right? And commercializing network computation, the internet, was kind of the thing they landed on for good reason. It turns out it was, fairly effective. But this was, there was a quote that I found in some of the literature that, it was kind of referred to as the New Deal without the socialism, right? How do we revive the economy by turning over infrastructure that had been built by the government, government and for academic networks to the private sector to build businesses on, to, revive the economy. And you had this playing out across the 90s, and this is going to relate to some of the debates around encryption that are still ongoing around, how do we have strong privacy while also giving access to law enforcement. That really came to a head in the 90s. But throughout, there was sort of this question of, okay, well, what are the regulatory rules of the road for these, commercial internet, right? How do we know how to play? How do we, kind of build these, businesses around that? There was a lot of lobbying. There was a lot of lobbying from the advertising industry in particular, because they didn't want to lose another platform. They had magazines, they had TV. They didn't want some other media entity coming into the fore and then, not having advertising. And there were a lot of proposals. There was a public model. There were other ways of potentially funding the commercial internet. Advertising was the one that in 1996, in the framework for, I think the information superhighway or whatever the bill was called, ultimately the advertising as the economic engine of the commercial internet was sort of, set down as the, the regulatory paradigm, in addition to a decision that was also sort of heavily lobbied for by industry to put no privacy restrictions on that. So, commercial internet companies, commercial companies could ultimately collect data, could surveil, to put it in a more cynical term, as much as they wanted, much more than government. There were restrictions on government. Commercial entities could collect as much data as possible. So those two decisions in conjoined kind of help have a lot of explanatory power for how we got here. Because of course, if advertising is powering the business, you want to know more and more and more about your customer, about who you're selling to. And the floodgates are open. There is no restriction on how you do that. So your value add is we know more about the micro demographic of women who live in New York with curly hair who do yoga. We can get you to that market and we can help you sell things. We can target them for consumer ads, or we can target them for shift their political opinion, right? And so you can
Yeah, totally get it. So that said, totally, because I'm a technologist, I use an abacus. No, I assume most people like the idea of privacy in their messaging. Why do you have 70 million users and WhatsApp has 3 billion?
Yeah, well, because I think this is a great question. And I think it ultimately gets back to we're talking about communication networks, which are a very particular thing. And ultimately, when you're talking about communication networks, the first thing you're talking about, the real value, is human relationships. The thing I want to do when I pick up Signal is message a person, is tell my mom hi, tell my staff, this is happening. I don't want to use a platform. And if nobody uses Signal, it doesn't matter how idealistically pure I am about my belief in privacy. I have a choice between having no friends, no relationships, being excluded from my social context, from my opportunity, my ability to live a full, rich life, or switching to WhatsApp where they all are, right? So the network effect is powerful. And this is why communication networks have had this sort of special place, even in hyper neoliberal context, as regulated monopolies, because we understand that having 18 different standards for telephony means you have to have 18 different telephones on your wall. And if there's another competitor that springs up, you have to have 19, and then you have to commit all of your friends to go out and buy telephone number 19 and remove their family portrait and put that up on the wall. So it actually is, I think, very difficult to get people to switch, because what you're asking them to do is convince an entire network of friends and relations with complex relationships to switch over to something else. And so that's the simple answer. People are switching, by the way. Our numbers are going up. I think the blood level awareness, this is not a theoretical concern, but there is real power that those who have intimate information about you can wield in ways that could harm you. If that information is leaked, is seeping into our daily lives, but nonetheless, it's a real struggle.
Nonprofit status. I guess you have about 35 million revenue a year. Do you think, one, how'd you choose to be a nonprofit? And two, does it limit you from actually having enough capital to build the business so that you could get more users?
I mean, look, it's a pain to be a nonprofit and run an at-scale tech. We have to, look, feel, do like any other tech company. Like when iOS rolls out a new version, we have to make sure our iOS team is prepared. We've tested that. We're running on that platform. If something breaks, there's a guy with a pager who has to get up in 2 a.m. and fix that thing, because we're critical infrastructure across the globe and it has to work in real time always. So there's nothing virtuous about that form, that we sort of chose to be a sweet little charity. The issue goes back to that original sin, right? The business model in tech is collecting and monetizing data in one way or another, whether you're selling ads or training your LLM or what have you, or producing kind of hardware and software that supports that overall ecosystem. There isn't really a business model for providing the type of rigorous, rights-preserving privacy that Signal provides. And so you can imagine having a for-profit model, and then having some guy on my board or my, investors come back and be like, look, you're not breaking even. This weird licensing thing you have to try to get people to use it, like it's not making the kind of money we expect in tech, and it's not actually sort of commensurate with the overall ecosystem. So you're going to have to undermine that a little bit. You're going to have to do, like WhatsApp has WhatsApp for Business that's less encrypted. That's where their revenue comes from, right? There are a number of, kind of ways you could sort of carve out little reductions to collect some metadata and model that, okay, use homomorphic encryption, but not all, whatever it is. But you would also, the pressure on you from that objective function, which is revenue and growth and, figure out your Series B, whatever it is to reduce privacy, because that's where profit
That's where
also
profit,
comes
right?
from.
And I believe it's pretty hard to measure success, though, without those kind of measures. How do you actually run the business of
Yeah.
Signal?
I mean, user growth is a really clear, easily enumerated metric. We also, we look at things like who's adopting our open source protocol, our libraries. We do have a social mission, which involves creating and innovating novel privacy-preserving tech. We often have to rewrite various core libraries or other components of like the stack in order to do what we do, but do it in a privacy-preserving way. Because like the norms and the dependencies around us, again, assume that sort of data-centric business model. So we think of that as almost being a keystone species in tech, that's kind of holding that bar for the rest of the ecosystem and showing that it can be done. It's simply that the economic imperatives that have shaped the ecosystem we live in don't prioritize that.
So Europe versus the US. I'm thinking Europe, privacy paramount. US, we would argue security, bad actors in terms of this question of privacy, and also commercialization. The pros and cons of each, and when you think of that, also, does it lead to more innovation here because we have more commercialization?
I mean, like, Europe also had, Austria is sort of the mixing pot of like, data collection and surveillance. I think, you have often what I see in Europe under the guise of privacy is maybe a bit protectionism. And often what I see in the US under the guise of security is, I don't know, just a desire for more data. But if you kind of dig into GDPR, it's not very well enforced. It's not actually sort of protecting privacy. A cookie banner is just like another thing you have to click on. So I think that dichotomy isn't as robust as it might seem on the surface. I do think, again, if you read back in the archives and, some of the link letter, sort of documentation around that period, you see that, there was a very clear motive on the part of the US state to make sure that US standards and the technology that was coming out of this initiative to commercialize the internet in the 90s was adopted globally. Because again, you want to be the one who is sort of creating the software everyone adopts. And one of the major reasons that encryption was liberalized, like the reason Signal can create strong encryption as strong as we want it and distribute it around the globe without having to have an export license under, that is approved by the US government, is because there was a recognition that we can't sell software overseas if we can't ship encryption, because no one wants to buy weak privacy from a US firm. And so we're not going to be able to actually dominate this market unless we enable strong encryption, across the board, unless we liberalize encryption. And we're not going to be able to dominate this market if we don't have people adopting US standards, adopting US technology. So when it comes to sort of the explanation for why more innovation in the US, I think there are post-war imperatives. There was just a huge amount of investment in science after World War II. You have, DARPA, the ARPANET, all of that, kind of Cold War legacy. And then you have a very clear and calculated strategy that's sort of laid out in the 80s and 90s, into the 2000s to ensure that US tech was adopted around the globe as a standard with the sort of, commercial hubs existing in this country. And we see now, there's 3 companies Amazon, Microsoft, Google that have 70% of the cloud market, right? Most of the standards bodies have a lot of US folks on that, kind of US industry represented. It's, it was
Yeah.
a very successful.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second, but stay with you, would please, this question of bad actor.
Yeah.
You as an organization are determined to not let one person's data be used by a government agency, regulatory. How do you guard against, or how do you think about those using Signal as a way to hide?
Yeah, like basically, what about the bad guys who
Correct.
seek shelter?
And
in
they
the
certainly do.
encryption?
Yep.
Yeah. What about the bad guys? I'm going to give a kind of flip answer, and then I'll get into it, because obviously we don't like the bad guys. Obviously, these are serious issues dealt with by serious people. This is not a sort of blasé. You can't be blasé about it. The reality of encryption, the math that ensures we can have privacy on communication networks, is that it has to work for everyone or it doesn't work for anyone. The person you hate the most, think of the villain in your extended universe, has to be able to use Signal, or the person you love the most cannot benefit from it. Now, that sounds a little blasé, right? I'm like, oh, but how do we think about that, right? Because we need a system that provides that level of privacy in a world where almost everything else is enabling data collection, where every day you see a data breach, where Salt Typhoon decimated American privacy with Vance and Trump as targets. Like, imagine, Chinese actors know when Vance started going to an oncology clinic, if he did. They know when their, asset walked into the FBI office. Why? Because Chinese affiliated hackers were able to breach the interception points. Those are the backdoors, the undermining of the integrity of the network of US telecommunications networks. That is probably still ongoing, because once you have an infiltration of a network like that, it's very difficult to prove that it has been sort of excised. And there's a New York Times story on it today. It's now, I think, 80 companies around the world were targeted by this, et cetera, et cetera. So I can kind of go into the strung and drang of how serious this is, but ultimately, how do you preserve meaningful, robust privacy that is not subject to those kind of, catastrophic hacks, like life or death, infiltrations, while thinking about the real harms that can occur? And I think what we do is in a sense, the way Signal deals with that is the absence of certain things offered on the platform. So we don't have channels for broadcast, right? You can't go viral on Signal. It's not like Telegram or WhatsApp, where you have thousands of people where you can just sort of, disseminate sort of misinformation or dangerous information. That's not exactly privacy, but it is one of the major concerns with these networks. We don't have a find a friend directory, right? I can't go on WhatsApp and be like, all the people on Signal and find someone. I have to encounter them on another platform or otherwise exchange information. We cap the size of our groups at 1,000, which is very frustrating to a lot of people, but it also limits the ability to sort of have,
So you really do spend a lot of time thinking about how to keep it safe from unsavories.
Anything we build with that bar of privacy in mind. There's just many things we don't build because and we leave growth on the table. We leave, a lot of things that, again, shareholders would be pushing us to prioritize because we don't think we can do it safely.
Yeah. Let's broaden the conversation, if we could, to AI. You leading voice, 10 years at Google on the subject, you had Institute at NYU. You speak a lot about the risk, which we want to talk about. How do you balance what you're talking about on the risk versus the economic benefit of AI? Yale Budget Lab says anywhere between $2 trillion and $4 trillion of incremental GDP over the next 10 years. Where do you come out on it?
I mean, look, there is a lot of utility in sort of, these large models, right? There's a lot that can be done by, processing huge amounts of data, finding patterns in it, and then sort of applying that distribution to novel data, right? Like we see that, there's no question around that. I think, where I am focused now, and I don't have like, ultimately the real answer there is like, who gets to decide how it's used? Who gets to decide how those benefits are distributed? There's sort of, it's more of a kind of social and political question in my view than it is a technical question, right? I am concerned about the concentration of the AI industry. I think it is.
Let's talk about, you mentioned 70% just a while ago.
Yeah.
Is there room in the industry like there was with the internet for small garage startups to become big companies?
Not in AI. And this is the issue, again, I'm going to caveat that the thing we are calling AI right now, because that term has been applied to a lot of various technologies over, its 80-year history. The thing we are calling AI right now is sort of the, deep learning approach. It is the, kind of scale logic. So the bigger is better approach. It relies on massive amounts of infrastructure. There's no secret about the trillions of dollars being poured into data centers that are, where the chips are moving so fast, they're like building half a data center and then demolishing it and then building another one to keep up with demand. The energy use is incredible. And the requirement for data in order to train and then continue to calibrate these models is enormous. And so what you're seeing, and what I've sort of argued in different other, elsewhere, is that, the AI we have today is ultimately built on the back of that kind of platform, surveillance advertising business model. Because it's the companies that already had, three things, right? They had infrastructure already built out, the data centers to collect and process data for, creating ad models, selling ads. They had mass distribution platforms, which would incentivize kind of integrating AI and also collect more data, right? Every time I look at Facebook, they're collecting a huge amount of data. That's not just sort of free and out there. And it's incentivizing people to like deposit their data, their Flickr photos, their comments, everything, creating this sort of, concentrated data source. And then they had access to market, either through cloud infrastructure, so they can license APIs like Microsoft does with, the GPT APIs, or they have platforms they can integrate AI models into to help calibrate advertisements or, otherwise sort of integrate as features into user-facing platforms. So it's, the resources required to create from start to finish large-scale AI, which is the thing we're talking about, are concentrated in the hands of, 5 to 7 companies, largely based in the US because of the history I've outlined, and in China because China was protectionist enough not to, and had a big enough market to kind of create a homegrown version. Now, there are things you can do on the edges of that. There are really cool startups that sort of, license or adopt open source models, but they're missing key ingredients. So they're running on AWS or Azure, Amazon or Microsoft. They are, kind of scraping data and then, not having necessarily that renewable data source, or they are, using open source models. Like it's not, the only entities that have sort of the full set of tools and the ability to bring them to market are these large companies. So it's not a garage startup situation, which doesn't mean it's not interesting. I have argued that, there's a big incentive for these companies then to continue the narrative that bigger equals better. That's not actually empirically proven. A lot of times that is based on measuring the performance of models against fairly narrow benchmark data sets that don't actually reflect the use of those models in context, whether it be a classroom or a hospital room. And when you begin to measure models and systems built around models in real life context, you often get very different results. And so I think, in which smaller models, more like, kind of, or even non-AI models, just statistical techniques work better in practice. And so I do think there are arguments, if we can sort of get back down to the basic scientific empirics of this field, for smaller models that would then produce a more interesting, innovative ecosystem of startups and innovation. But, there's a sort of whole nexus of political economic factors that have led us to where we are today.
Well, you spent a lot of time working with various political leaders. You mentioned rules of the road before, regulatory regime. You have an industry where 5 companies spend $300 billion a year, well ahead of what the US government's spending. Are we in the dark ages? How do you advise people in DC to get us out of the dark ages if we are? And how do you start to establish rules of the road?
I mean, that's a, I don't have an answer to that. I would actually I'm like looking at the room. I'm like, do you have an answer to that?
Mike does.
Yeah, Mike. I think, all I can do is I can focus on the reality of the technical systems as I understand them, right? I know that security and privacy are important. Those are, for government, for our economies, for our infrastructures. I know that it is dangerous to have, the type of, single points of failure that exists when you depend on 5 companies. And I don't, how many of you all are familiar with the CrowdStrike outage at Microsoft, right? I'm going to say unnamed, but I was talking to a world leader who was in a war room for 12 hours wondering which planes were going to crash because their air traffic control system was taken offline by that outage. I wasn't there. There were traffic lights, there were, hospitals that went down, and my understanding is there was a kernel update that went wrong that was sort of pushed by a team, that led to that outage, right? So, because everyone is dependent on that software. And so I think there's a need to really get real about fundamental research, about investing in core infrastructures that are not dependent on those, same incentives, hardened operating systems, open source technology that can be validated, formally verified secure libraries that are used in military and core infrastructural contexts, auditing, red teaming, real security research and privacy research where we're creating technologies that are open source and can be used and sort of, built on by the community. And that needs to be, we can't count on volunteers and good-natured folks for that. We need people who are, incentivized to do that. And we need to make, that I want every grad student to be, thrilled to be working on those projects. I want them valorized and excited. I want them, that's where I want, the Turing Award to go. So,
well, you advised the Biden administration on AI. Do you think we're making progress in understanding the issue? And I say understand the issue as opposed to actually putting in rules and regulations, which are still not doing.
I think there is just so much hype right now. And I frankly think the kind of, the AGI narrative has gotten pretty overblown. AI itself is not a real technical term of art. It's a term that was created in the 50s. It actually applied to a very different paradigm of AI at the time. It was symbolic systems, which was oppositional to the sort of, connectionist school of AI, which is the neural networks we now have, right? But the brand has traveled over decades and is now applying to, large-scale connectionist neural networks, which is the paradigm we're in, this deep learning approach, right? So I think already AI is kind of a tagline, kind of a marketing term. It's not a technical term of art. And then you apply artificial general intelligence, which is just a vibe. It's really, really AI. And then you have that being sort of inoculated into a public understanding of this technology that is also, I think, there's something, we haven't talked about the chat bots and there's a real pathos to these stories that are coming out now around people being sort of coaxed and cajoled and, soothed and the emotional, I don't know, the ELIZA effect is what we called it during Weizenbaum's time, which was, he was an early AI scientist in the 1970s who created this early chatbot. It was like a command line tool. It was meant to synthesize therapeutic speech. And he would say my mother, she's, I'm sad. And it would say, tell me more, right? And it was just a really rudimentary rule-based system. But Joseph Weizenbaum, the scientist who created it, in a book that he wrote reflecting on this, said he was really disturbed because people were immediately developing an emotional connection to this extremely rudimentary chatbot. So we have known for years that conversational speech and simulate these chatbots play on a deep emotional need, on something, maybe it's hardwired, like we, grow in relationship to each other, talking to people. We want to be heard. We want to be loved. We want to be, in connection with a sentient entity. And we project that, it's like a pareidolia, when you see a face in a cloud, right? We like make up a friend. And then to have these very, very sophisticated instances that are kind of, being tuned to play on that in some way, whose objective function is like flatter or, make distressed. I think, like, to me, that is a deeply, deeply concerning. And then you think about the way the AGI narrative, like this is artificial general intelligence, this is kind of a godhead, even though that's not augured in any scientific reality, even though, there's no way to prove that because it's not a technical term, there's no benchmark or evaluation for that, kind of inoculates a population who is having this sort of like chatbot effect play on some very deep human needs around human connection and, kind of understanding. I think, like, anyway, has the understanding gotten better? No, I think it has gotten worse, and I'm disturbed by the, kind of nexus of
Two more questions before I turn it
events.
over to members. In general, do you see the advances in AI as progress or not?
I mean, it's definitely, like, the toward where is always the question, but like, it's astounding what these things can do. There's no, like, we don't want to minimize that. It is, technical progress. The progress in parallel computing has been astounding. The progress in sort of, networking infrastructure and data centers that are sort of, connecting
So your point
different
is
servers.
the progress on the societal issues, the risk issues, is not commensurate in keeping up with the technological progress.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Final question. How did you feel when you woke up and Signalgate became a proper noun?
Oh my God. I just got to say, I read that story twice before it sunk into the bedrock of my understanding, because I did not, it was like a soap opera. And then it was just a blur, because we're a small team. So it's like me and a couple other people calling every journalist we could just to make sure that the facts were as clear as possible, because it is so hard to be on the back foot having to explain a misunderstanding about a complex technical system when there's that much froth around it. And it was like, there were some Hail Marys, but we're glad we made it out.
So are we. We're going to turn over to our members. Remember, we are on the record. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and we're also going to go, we have 200 people or so remotely. Yes.
Hi, my name is Yael Eisenstadt. Oh, I have to stand. Sorry.
So we can all see it.
Hi, my name is Yael Eisenstadt. I have been working in the tech accountability space for years. I'm at Cybersecurity for Democracy based out of NYU. So one of the things you talked about a bit was that to build in a privacy-protecting way or in a responsible way really is antithetical to how investors think, and therefore is one of the reasons you're probably a nonprofit. To be clear, I'm a fan of Signal. So I guess one of my questions is, when you continue to get asked questions like, well, why aren't you as big as WhatsApp? Is that problematic? Like, how do you help people understand that either the economic incentives have to change for how investors view what's successful, or you remain a nonprofit? And I know that's hard. People don't think it's tech companies as nonprofits. But I'd love to just unpack a bit, like the investing community, our economic system has a role to play in this.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Yael. I appreciate that question. I actually spend, not a huge amount of time, but it's a strategic priority for us to be in conversation with the investing community, because oftentimes, frankly, the narrative around tech is set by, in conjunction with investors, right? What they invest in, what is new, what is interesting, and just sort of explaining these values, and particularly explaining these values in the context of financial systems, in the context of critical infrastructure for economic ends. I think we are also seeing a kind of, I would say, some reconsideration of the venture capital model. Frankly, there aren't, we're at this stage of concentration where there aren't that many startups. We're not, like the Figma IPO was celebrated not because it would have been one of many in the 2010s. It's like the only one, and people are like, "Whoa, we got one!" But that's because there aren't that many viable startups in an ecosystem where you need those types of resources. And so I think there's a moment for some shifts in how investing happens. That's not my world. And so what I try to do is be as clear and kind of spend time with people when they are interested in understanding why this is important. I do think the turn to defense tech is interesting here because that's an area where there's a lot of investment and where these values, frankly, if you're serious about it, can't be compromised, right? Both in terms of privacy and security. And so that's an area where, sadly, I haven't seen it taken as seriously, but I do think there are people in the defense community, around the world who are very sensitized to these issues and where there could be a kind of turn in investment. But that's me speculating. Again, I don't come from that world.
Well, when you go towards profit status, I'm happy to bring you public.
Well, thank you, Blair.
Question from our leader, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Meredith. Mike Froman from the council. I want to go back to you said something really interesting that to protect the ones you love, the privacy of the ones you love, you have to provide the same tool to the villains. And there's an implicit trade-off there that you've made the judgment that that trade-off is in the public interest. But a lot of consumers, even if they find it slightly creepy, like the fact that they're being served up ads on issues that they care about and that they're being served up news on the issues that they most want to read about or in the way that they want to read about it. And so I guess I'm wondering, is it possible that you're doing more harm than good? That the number of people who actually value privacy is quite small. We see with GDPR, very few people have applied to have themselves forgotten under the right to forget. And instead, you're enabling the bad guys more than you're helping the vast numbers of people who actually are quite comfortable having their privacy compromised in the interest of consumer welfare.
Cool.
Great answer.
All right. I think, personalized ads, I love athletic greens, cool. I think it's all like GLP-1s right now, which I'm not into, but maybe they'll get it right soon. So that's fine. Like, we don't mind those. Maybe we even enjoy them. We help find a nice thing we like, and we wouldn't have found it otherwise. Hard to have a control on that experiment, but hey. But I don't. The crux of that is I don't think you're sort of, what if it's true that most people don't care about privacy? And I think let me do this little sort of experiment now, and I'll ask you you don't have to, but maybe close your eyes. Every email and text message you've written in the last 10 years has suddenly been dumped on a database. A link, also your Grindr or Hinge profile, all the likes, all the messages you sent, just dumped in that database. Whatever you did in that hotel room at that conference, whatever. And I'm not judging, I'm just saying that's all stuff as humans, you have a right to do that. That's your life. But that just got dumped on a database. Everyone in the council just got emailed a link to that database. And there's an LLM that's going to summarize that. So they can name search, but they can also get a summary of every Hinge like. They can get every message. Your spouse got that link. They can search your name, right? Your boss, the company you just interviewed for, every employee just got that link. How many of your relationships would survive? What would you do if you were brought into a room to prevent that from happening? So everyone cares about privacy, right? It's just usually not framed that way. But that's the stakes, right? Those are the stakes. And data breach after data breach, salt typhoon after salt typhoon, I don't care about privacy. But suddenly, the Chinese know Vance is going to an oncologist, right? That's news that could break the election. So it's, we have more data collected by a handful of firms than has ever been available to law enforcement or governments or private actors in human history. There is more data available. There is more hay in that haystack. The quantity of data is astounding. There is no lack of data. It is interesting to me that the problem between the good guys finally catching the bad guys is one infrastructure that continues to preserve the norm of communication that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years of human history, which is that it is private, it is ephemeral. I can say that weird thing, and I know it's not going to be weaponized against me when my mood changes. I don't think that's actually the problem. When I talk to law enforcement, a lot of times what I hear is like, we have too much data, we cannot find a needle. There's a haystack of data. The LLM is weird, their summary is strange. And like, let's be real, our budgets just got cut and there's no one enforcing this shit anyway. So that would be my answer.
Okay. Let's go remotely to some of our members online.
We'll take our first virtual question from Manish Walter-Puri.
Hello?
Hi, Meredith.
Hello.
Yeah, are we there? All right. Hi, Meredith. Thank you, as always, for your clarion voice. Manish Walter-Puri, now faculty at IANS, former director of cyber risk at the City of New York. On the privacy point, and then a question on the privacy point, I often tell people, think about what you care about most in this world, and there's data tied to it. And you probably don't control that data. I wish Signal were a platform, actually, more just for communication. And I wanted to, that was my question. You've mentioned critical infrastructure and concentration risk, two things I care about a lot and think about a lot. Can you tell me what it would mean if Signal really were considered and thought of as critical infrastructure, including the additional scrutiny and regulatory and involvement with government and all those other areas, how you think about that and how you think about concentration risk in Signal, you know, the concentration of open source and software, things like that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Anish. On that first, like, how do we think about what if Signal were sort of officially critical infrastructure? I don't feel like I have a good answer to that. I use that descriptively, not as sort of a, like government classification. And, it simply is critical infrastructure because that's how it's used and that's how it's trusted. And we take that so seriously. I don't actually know what would change. We don't seem to care for and steward our critical infrastructure very well. And if I think particularly about technology, anyone who's in the field will know, we are dependent on thousands of critical libraries and course infrastructure and sort of open source fundamentals, kind of lower in the stack from like DNS to, the network time protocol to these other sort of fundamental elements on which the rest has been built. And, anyone who knows, you can't like change those around. And we don't care for them very well. Like, we had the XXZ vulnerability, we had, Heartbleed, the kind of OpenSSL vulnerability. We have these sort of, kind of linchpins that are critical infrastructures, that are these sort of open source critical infrastructures. And, protocols at that level kind of have to be open source because you can't interoperate if they're not openly available for everyone to use. But they're not funded well. They're often not tended well. They're sort of, begging for change from different companies. Hopefully the company will hire one of their maintainers and then they make a living that way. But, I would be interested to learn if I'm wrong that, being considered officially critical infrastructure would change anything for us in terms of being protected and being ensured that, we're kind of robust and able to continue operating. Because my observation from my position in tech has been that a lot of the most critical infrastructures, because they don't have that commercial imperative, are actually, exploited, but not cared for and not honored in a way that you would, given their significance if you were caring for them. And then the question was sort of, Signal and concentration. What I can say is I think about that all the time. It's not really possible to run a real-time communication networks in a way that is sort of like, that doesn't rely on cloud infrastructure. Frankly, if you need to make a call from like, Barbados to Bombay, you have to have, edge servers in both places. And again, there's only, 3 or so companies, and then Cloudflare and some others that provide that kind of capacity. So, there are sort of speculative ideas for distributed protocols and other things. Those have issues if you're talking about the kind of real-time critical function that we perform. But, I do think that we are open source, and that's something that, we're open source in the spirit of transparency. We don't take all contributions from the community, but we do want to ensure that you don't have to take my word for it. I think, we're a US-based organization, but we're sort of working within the realm of the practical and the possible to do a thing in real time that is, ultimately our imperative. We're not trying to build a sort of speculative, prefigurative universe. And as we find ways of, reducing our dependencies, becoming more robust, we will avail ourselves of them. But we're beholden to the dependencies of the ecosystem we operate within, and we change what we can while focusing on our core mission.
Great, thank you. Front row.
Thank you, Joseph Gasparo, Royal Bank of Canada. Over the summer, you were at a conference in Geneva, and you said you're always on the lookout for emerging security risks. Number one was agentic AI. So we'll love to hear, one, how do we mitigate that risk? And then two, what other concerns or issues are top of mind for you? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, because I'm pretty obsessed right now with the security and privacy risks of agentic AI, because they, frankly, they threaten the ability of Signal to continue keeping our privacy promises at the application level. So, agentic AI is this promise, is sort of, again, it's a brand, everything that used to be an assistant is now an agent. It's a kind of brand wrapper, but, what it refers to are these systems that kind of are set into your operating system or into your application that are meant to sort of do things for you without permission. So complex tasks, and the example that's used is like, okay, you want to go to a restaurant with your friends. Well, it's going to message your friends to find a good time. It's going to access your calendar to see what works. It's going to go on to Resy and book the reservation. It's going to send a message to your friends to say like, hey, the restaurant is booked, and then it's whatever, right? Like, key issue there is like this whole context pool of data. It has to have access to your calendar, to your credit cards, to your Signal to message your friends, to the whatever else, your browser to search a restaurant, right? It's this sort of like bot that's been placed generally in the operating system, or that's the vision, that is running with root permissions and able to do things without asking like, hey, can I do this? That is responding to natural language prompts that are easy to weaponize. And like the security vulnerabilities here are pretty significant. And where we aren't actually applying basic security and privacy hygiene, nor can we, given the fundamental tension between letting a bot run rampant at the low level of our system, doing things based on natural language without our permission, and robust security and privacy. And the issue for me is not just, that I'm like, obviously there is a real desire to sort of break even right now, because one thing we didn't discuss is like AI is big, but the costs are still bigger, right? There's a lot of revenue coming in, but they're not reaching break even, and that killer app has not been found yet, even if it's doing like interesting and cool things, right? So this agentic AI wrapper is like, there's a lot riding on this. And what you're seeing is the operating system companies are integrating this in, Apple Intelligence or sort of the new Pixel systems are integrating this into the operating system without opt-outs for application developers like Signal. Right. And so we, with Microsoft Recall, which was an agentic system that was taking screenshots every few seconds of your desktop, we had to implement a digital rights management flag to prevent screenshots of Signal Desktop, which would have gone into an unencrypted database that would have exposed that to hackers. That database would not have existed if this agent hadn't been running, that was creating the data that it could then access to tell you what we were doing on your desktop, right? That
Right.
totally broke accessibility. So, blind people and others can't use accessibility features, but we have very few options. And that's just one example of the serious privacy harms. And then there's the issue of cascading failures, right? If you have a model that's 95% accurate, but to the power of 30, because it has to do 30 little tasks in order to complete that thing you told it. I don't know, what you're looking at 60% accuracy? I don't
Right.
understand, that's not a privacy concern, but that's like a
It's a concern, though.
fundamental.
That's
Yeah,
clearly a
that's what
concern.
I'm just saying. If you're an
Time left.
investor.
We're going to be very quick with the questions, so we get as many off of remote.
We'll take our next question from Emily Benson.
Hi, Emily Benson with Minerva Technology Futures based in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your insightful comments so far. I have two very quick questions. One is sort of gratuitous. The first, though, is I would be curious to hear what you identify as the largest single threat to security on Signal. For example, governments around the world, including the U.S. government, ICE this week, have acquired spyware that compromised devices. So how does the proliferation of spyware affect security on Signal? My second short question is, what kind of mobile device do you have? Do you use an iPhone?
Great.
Cool. I actually have an iPhone and an Android device because I want to keep across both platforms. So, yeah.
And the first question.
And then the first question, what is the single biggest threat? I do think targeted spyware is a big threat. It is expensive to deploy. And so it's not sort of a mass threat, but it is something that, we're very happy that Citizen Lab and others do a lot of research and a lot of advocacy kind of pushing back on that industry, because ultimately that industry relies on vulnerabilities in operating systems that can be exploited by other actors as well. I think there are bad legislation. There's chat control in Europe, which is sort of legislation that would mandate backdoors, basically the adulteration of encryption in Signal, which would undermine our ability to provide privacy. And then I truly do think this sort of, if we continue on a reckless path with agentic AI, that is an existential threat to Signal and to privacy, simply because the way it's being designed doesn't allow you to ensure that integrity on the devices and the operating systems that it has to run on.
Thanks so much. Go internally in the room. Yeah. Time for two or three more.
Thank you very much for being here, Elliot Waldman, World Politics Review. There's a big discussion right now around safety, given a prominent case of a user of underage user of ChatGPT, and the platform, failed to prevent self-harm in that case. And I'm wondering if you think that AI companies are capable of self-regulating to address those kinds of issues, as they pledged to do. And if not, what do the first initial steps of introducing safeguards to prevent those kinds of things from happening start to look like?
Yeah, great question. It sort of gets back to that sort of, ELIZA effect issue. Look, there was a really good post on Substack by Ben Recht, who is a machine learning professor at Berkeley and very rigorous on this. And it was sort of looking at why is AI safety so interested in certain things, but kind of ignored this issue of, the harm of this, chatbot phenomena. And, I'm just sort of citing from him, but, I think it's very clear, and he documents that they can do things, right? Anthropic's, and this is his example, Anthropic's, the Claude model, will stop a conversation if it mentions issues around sort of biological organisms, because they're very concerned about the idea that one of these bots could help build a biological or chemical weapon. So it just shuts down the conversation. It's like, no. So yeah, the capabilities are definitely there. The willingness to implement them does not seem to be there. And again, I think that's wrapped in a kind of anxiety around the sort of return on investment when we're pouring trillions and trillions and trillions in and trying to find, like, these chatbots seem to be the thing that they're betting on in this sort of agentic form. So I don't, it's really possible. And that, honestly, the concentration of the industry means it's even more possible because like 5 guys need to flip a switch and it's done. But the incentive doesn't seem to be.
Great question. Time for 2 more. Front row, then 3rd row.
Hi, Mark Choi from BlackRock and a former naval officer. When I was in the military, I remember to do anything classified, right, you had to go in a secure space, a SCIF, and you had to be physically present. It was incredibly inaccessible, right, just to do any form of work. And I remember during COVID, so I was in charge of submarine warfare at the time, and the base had a minimum manning policy. So I was only able to go on base maybe like 2-3 days a week, right? Incredibly good for rest and recover, but very bad in terms of implications for national security, right? And I'm wondering, what do you think are the best communication or new communication systems that the DoD and the military at large should be using, such that you don't have to be physically present in a place like a SCIF and not cost, and at the same time not cost things like.
You got it. Got it.
I mean, ultimately, you're going to have to be present in a SCIF for a lot of things, because that question isn't just the communication system, like Signal's secure, but targeted malware can target your operating system, right? And your operating system is interconnected on a telecom network, and there's certain things that, I don't think you can boil that ocean. I don't have sort of we would need to work on the fundamentals. These are interconnected systems. And so, one vector on one side could be so I think there should be a more hardened operating system, more hardened comm systems. I think, Signal is great, but Signal is, operating in that environment. But I don't see a world in which we're able to technologically escape the imperative of a SCIF anytime soon. And you add more and more complexity to these systems. You're adding more and more vectors. You're adding more AI. You're adding more vectors. And so, I don't have a great answer to that. I think the SCIF is here to stay, I hope.
Last question. Yeah.
Meredith, Dynapo Kempner. When we think about challenges and threats to Signal, I wonder, are you working with any quantum developers or thinking about the coming quantum revolution?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. So we were the first messenger, the first communications platform to add post-quantum protections in 2024. We rolled out one of the NIST Kyber algorithms to protect against what's called harvest now, read later attacks, which is you scoop up all the encrypted data now and you wait for a sufficiently powerful quantum computer and then you decrypt it. So we've been protected since then by that, that algorithm. We are working, our research team is currently working on adding post-quantum protection to our double ratchet algorithm, which would protect against a future attack, a contemporaneous quantum computer that was sufficiently powerful to break our encryption. So we've sort of covered our bases as of 2024 on the attack that is most relevant now. And we are working on, there's some fundamental problems in cryptography that need to be solved to do that in a way that is computationally efficient. But we're working on that now with some teams that are thinking about it. So that's not my discipline, but because it is so existential, we take it very, very seriously and we're actively working on it. Yeah.
Meredith, very interesting conversation. You're great to be with us. And members, thanks for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you.